Hey everyone, I'm Carlo LaRosso from Secrets of Home Theater and High Fidelity. And today what we have for you is the Auralic Aries G2.1 wireless streaming transport. Hey guys, so here we have the Aries G2.1, and Auralic basically aims this as their top of the line streamer. They want this to be your complete digital front end to control and manage your entire music library, whether that's streamed from music services like Qobuz, Tidal, internet radio, or it's available on a network attached server on your network, or a universal plug and play server of some sort on your network. It also has provisions to plug in a hard drive via USB at the back or a thumb drive. And also inside it has a carriage to hold up to a 2 terabyte laptop size hard drive full of music as well. It will stream music wirelessly or through an Ethernet cable, which is how I have it hooked up here. It will also pretty much play any file format and bit depth that you want to throw at it. 32-bit, 384 kilohertz PCM, to DSD 512. It's a pretty complete unit, and it's got some fairly serious file handling capabilities. It's also built like a tank. I mean, you can't tell just strictly looking at it from this angle, but it weighs just over 20 pounds, so it's solid and really heavy and well put together. So as a premium product, it's priced approximately $5,000 or thereabouts US. So that being said, one of the only things it doesn't have is a built-in DAC. You have to hook it up to an external DAC in order to get music out of it. It's strictly digital. Or of course, Auralic makes DACs that you can use with it via their proprietary Lightning Link connection, which is advertised and built as being two-way, almost completely jitter-free connection. But you can hook it up to practically any DAC that doesn't require a driver for a Linux computer, because it's this basically runs on a form of Linux inside it. So that being said, $5,000, top-notch product, very up there, for not for everybody. So since it's a digital streamer, the question then becomes, well, what separates something like this from something like this? A Raspberry Pi based digital endpoint that I put together. Cost me about $225 worth of parts, a couple hours worth of my time to put it together, and a little bit of research on the internet to get the instructions and make sure I wasn't screwing anything up. It works very well. I've used it for a considerable amount of time now. Again, just hook it up to a DAC via the USB connection, and it will, pass just about anything, any file format through it within the capabilities of the connected DAC. So, what is the difference? That's a good question, and it's a valid question. There are a number of similarities, and there are also some pretty distinct differences as well. And that is what we shall be covering starting now.
So delving a little more closely into the build quality and features of these two seemingly disparate digital music units, looking at the Raspberry Pi endpoint first, the first thing you're struck with is the really nice looking 7-inch full color touchscreen, which is very pleasant to use. It's very responsive, easy to see from across the room. The rest of the unit is basically on a pivoting hinge, a plastic pivoting hinge, and the size is generally very compact, and so doesn't take up too much real estate space. Switching to the back of the Raspberry Pi, you can easily see how it's essentially a motherboard inside a little tiny computer case. It's actively cooled by a fan. The fan is set to low speed, so it's very quiet. You really can't hear it in this room at all when there's no music playing. You can obviously see the Ethernet connection and the USB connection, which goes to a DAC. So as my endpoint essentially uses RoPi XL OS software to effectively act as a Rune bridge and create an endpoint, it requires Rune to operate. And here is a shot of the Rune window open on my Surface tablet that I use as the core. And there you can see the RoPi endpoint is selected. So now that I've finished showing you David, we're going to switch over to Goliath here, and I'm going to give you a sense of the serious differences in build quality, in case you hadn't figured out, between the Raspberry Pi endpoint and the Aries G2.1. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the Aries G2.1 is pretty heavy for its size. It's about just under 21 pounds, and after removing the thick aluminum bottom plate, we are met with a very solid and sturdy looking thick black aluminum frame. There is also these 4 solid aluminum billets, one on each side, that I've had to unscrew and remove in order to access the thick copper plate that covers the internals. Now, that copper plating is for additional shielding, but it's a very serious looking piece of metal covering the guts of this thing. Once we take off the thick copper plate, we are greeted with the internals of the Aries G2.1, which are housed in what looks like an additional copper subchassis. At the top left, you'll see the carriage that can store up to a 2 terabyte SSD drive for internal music storage. It's empty in this particular case. To the right of that are 2 linear independent power supplies, and then down below that you see the main board. It looks like the input and output section of the board. We don't see any of the main processor or the femto clocks, which presumably are either underneath the board or on the other side of the board underneath it as well. But this is a very, very seriously well put together piece of equipment here, with like a dual chassis construction, very serious shielding, and very solidly put together innards for sure. So turning to the business end of the Aries G2.1, starting with the 2 wireless antenna connections, which will handle all current flavors of 802.11 Wi-Fi. We then have the gigabit Ethernet connection for wired local area network connection. You have your USB connection for your hard drive or USB stick, which will have all your music files to it. You can also hook up an external USB CD drive here, and the Aries will allow you to play your favorite CDs through the system, as well as rip them directly to FLAC files. There is the asynchronous USB output to hook up to your DAC of choice. The Aries will talk to pretty much any DAC that doesn't need a Linux driver. It worked just fine with my Topping D90 SE and my Benchmark DAC 3B without an issue. Next to that is the Lightning Link connection. Now, this is a proprietary connection that Auralic uses between its streamers and its own DACs. It's a 2-way connection, which Auralic says is specially designed and tuned to almost eliminate jitter in the connection. It uses a HDMI jack, but don't try to hook up any old regular HDMI cable to it, because the pins are wired completely differently in the Lightning Link protocol. So next to that is, of course, your optical output. Next to that is your coax output. Those will top out at 24,192. Anything larger or DSD needs to go through the USB connection to the DAC. Next is the balanced AES digital output, and that pretty much sums up the connectors. Of course, if you use Rune, the Aries G2.1 will be seen and configured like a simple Rune endpoint and function perfectly fine, just like that. But if you have music on a network attached storage of some sort or other server on your local network, the Aries will access it. Or you can simply take a external hard drive like this one right here, plug it in via USB to the back of the Aries, and then fire up the Lightning DS app. Once the Lightning DS app opens up, it will sense and scan the drive and immediately index all your music files and download the appropriate album art and metadata that's needed. So it'll allow you to completely access all your music files that you have on that drive. And yes, while the metadata and image presentation isn't as thorough and complete as, say, if you were using Rune, it also means that you don't need a separate subscription to play your music library. So there you go. Lightning DS will also allow you to access your Tidal and Qobuz subscriptions if you have those. And as you can see, once you are logged into them, you can access your music on Qobuz or Tidal very easily. So no separate computer is required to run any sort of library or other music playing software. The Aries will act as its own core. Now, when acting as its own central music control center, the Aries G2.1 has a simple menu structure that you can see on its small 3-inch screen, and it can be accessed and cycled through by using the combination of the 4 buttons that are to the right of it. And using those buttons, you can get into pretty much every facet of how the Aries is configured and operates. You can definitely go into the library and playlist side of things, but you could also go into the hardware and configuration side of things and get really far into the nitty-gritty of settings and resampling and all sorts of things like that. The only downside to configuring the Aries through its screen and buttons is that you have to look really closely at it, and it makes things a little difficult to configure that way, text and icons being as small as they are. However, I can use the Lightning DS software to access all the setup and configuration settings of the Aries G2.1 right here on my iPad screen, so it's much easier to see and scroll through, and it's a much nicer and consistent experience altogether. So you can set it up this way as well.
So the question now becomes, how does the Aries G2.1 sound? Well, in a nutshell, it sounds absolutely lovely when configured properly and hooked up to a DAC of commensurate quality. Sitting in my listening chair with my stereo system and a good set of speakers, it absolutely sounds, stunning. Detail was fantastic. Didn't feel like I was missing anything. Crystal clear, very nice imaging. Nothing bad I can say about the sound quality at all. That being said, the Raspberry Pi endpoint, when used as it should be, configured with Rune and hooked up to, the same DAC using the same connection, in my case, asynchronous USB, also sounded fantastic. From my listening chair, it's really hard to find any meaningful sonic differences between the two of them. Now, with that statement, I can immediately imagine a bunch of you saying, wait a minute, how can you honestly say that a $5,000, whiz-bang digital front-end streaming transport that's immaculately put together sounds, comparable or can have a Raspberry Pi endpoint that I cobbled together in a couple hours sound virtually indistinguishable from themselves? Well, it's not. It's not quite as cut and dry as that, and a bit of context is in order. So, if you let me step back a little bit, I'll explain my reasoning to you. So the Aries hangs its hat on being strictly designed for one purpose, and that is music reproduction. And its job is to get as completely as possible the entire digital signal from whatever format it's reading from, whether it's file or disk, with a minimum amount of jitter from the source to the destination, which in this case is the DAC. And as I've showed you earlier on in this video, the Aries G2.1 is probably one of the most overbuilt and well-designed pieces of digital equipment I think I've ever seen. From the dual chassis construction, to the heavy copper shielding, to the dual power supplies, to the dual femto clocks, to the proprietary lightning link connection, bespoke circuitry design, etc., etc., etc. All of it to get music from here to there as completely as possible, and with the minimum amount of jitter as possible. Jitter is defined as distortion artifacts that result from timing errors in a digital signal. There is some debate out there as to how much jitter you can actually hear in musical content before it becomes an issue. I've not researched this, but I'm strictly telling you what the definition of jitter is, so that way you know and we're all on the same page. In comparison, the Raspberry Pi is a jack of all trades. It's a little computer that you can do all kinds of things with, and in this particular case, it's been configured for music reproduction as an endpoint. And as such, it doesn't have the same sort of specializations built into it or designed into it as the Aries G2.1 does. So you could, naturally infer that the digital output of the Raspberry Pi would not quite be as pristine as what you'd get out of the Aries. Be a natural assumption. Now, while the Aries uses its dual femto clocks as a strategy to send as pristine a signal as possible to the DACs for them to do their thing with, the DACs themselves also incorporate strategies inside them. Good ones do, like the benchmark DAC 3B and the topping D90S that I'm using here. Those DACs incorporate strategies inside them as well to reduce jitter, regardless of the digital signal coming in. So, that being said, you could also say that the DACs are giving a disproportionately higher amount of aid to the incoming signal of the Pi as opposed to the Aries in order to, make the comparisons between the two a little more difficult to make. The point is, when it comes to comparing two completely digital pieces of equipment in a system like this, even if it's a very resolving system, sitting in a chair about 9 to 10 feet away is exceedingly difficult, because the DACs, the preamp, your power amp, your speakers, we're not even going to get into the room, are going to have a much bigger impact on what you're ultimately hearing at that seat, and that gets translated from your ears to your brain, than these two digital front ends can possibly have. It's just the way it is. I get very wary when I hear people wax eloquently that they can hear these stark and amazing differences between two such components sitting in that sort of scenario, when in order to compare them properly, you would need, and with the same inputs and the same, parameters, you would need to spend at least 10 to 15 minutes shutting everything down, disconnecting things, swapping cables, firing everything back up, going back in the chair, queuing up your tracks. It's a really difficult thing to do, and to honestly make those sorts of qualitative conclusions. So in order to get a better handle on what, if any, differences there were between these two units, and to see if something more subtle was actually going on, I decided to focus in on headphone listening. So to that end, I decided to hook up both the Aries and the Raspberry Pi to my benchmark DAC 3B via coaxial digital input. The DAC has two coaxial digital inputs that can be easily switched between. The Aries was a direct coax connection, while the Pi had to be, its USB output had to be routed to a topping D10S USB to SPDIF converter. then the coax went from that converter into the benchmark DAC, and it made for a more apples to apples comparison. I figured that would be better than relying on one DAC being hooked up via USB and the other one being hooked up via coax in case there are any inherent differences between the two. I don't know, but much more apples to apples, both being coax input. The DAC is routed through my benchmark HPA4 preamp and headphone amp. Both are designed to work seamlessly together, and they make a fantastically clean, listening setup. So any differences would be easily apparent in that using that equipment. The headphones I decided to use were my Danny Clark Audio Aeon 2 Noir closed back planar headphones. Really great sounding, very familiar with them, and they also help to block out any room sounds that I might get using open back headphones, and that would help me really hone in on any real differences that would crop up. The two units were both hooked up to my Roon core via Ethernet wired connection, and the core was set up to play the same tracks to both the Aries and the Pi. So in order to make the switch between the two at any given point, all I would need to do is press one button on the DAC to switch the coax inputs, and then a swipe and a button on my phone that controlled Roon, and I would tell it which one to start playing music through. So invariably it would only be seconds to switch between the Aries and the Pi, so it would be much easier to make and find out any real differences between the two that way. So using this setup, and after listening to a wide variety of genres of music at different resolutions and bit depths, I ended up hearing some really subtle differences between the Pi and the Aries. Again, very subtle stuff, and it wasn't consistent between all kinds of music. It really became apparent to me when I was listening to classical or jazz. There were subtle details that I thought the Aries was relaying better when it came to spatial cues in this recording space that the music was recorded in. Things like reverb, things like the shimmer details off a cymbal, or the decaying ring of a piano note. In really well recorded stuff, I found that the Aries, I feel like I could sense just a bit more detail in those little things. Again, it wasn't consistent across all the tracks I listened to, but it did keep cropping up in a select number of tracks that I would go back to after listening to other stuff. I would pop back to them, and it's like, did I really hear that? And it's like comparing the two, switching back and forth. Sometimes it's like, yes, there is a little something going on there. But yeah, again, it's very subtle stuff. And to be perfectly honest, it's the kind of stuff that I wouldn't necessarily, notice sitting at a listening chair a bunch of feet away. I had to use headphones to hear it. So yes, it's there, but it's really subtle. But it's there. So where does that leave us? Well, look, there are different kinds of audiophiles out there. If you're the kind of audiophile for whom, getting the best bang for your buck is a primary concern, then, a $225, build cost Raspberry Pi endpoint made it to a $1,000-ish high quality DAC and a Roon subscription is a great way to get you like an excellent and really good listening and user experience when it comes to a digital streaming device. There are a few drawbacks with that. One being you're your own support person when it comes to the Pi. You have to do the research and the legwork to figure out how to put it together, how to get it up and running and all that stuff. It's not difficult, but it takes a little work. And if something breaks, you're your own IT person. It's up to you to fix it. Or you need to have a Roon subscription. And at the current going rates at the time I shot this video, it's about $10 a month to subscribe, or a $699 lifetime price to have a lifetime membership to Roon. and you also need a separate computer to run Rune Core on. So there's a few things to do. There's a little bit of legwork to do on your end. But if that doesn't bother you, and you like to tinker and you're a DIY person, it could be a great experience having the Pi as a digital music streamer. And it was fun for me to put it together, and I think anyone who's interested in audio should take a crack at it. I think it's a great way to to learn and try something new out. On the other hand, the Aries G2.1 is for someone who demands the very best in their audio gear. Beyond the fact that objectively its performance may be the best that they can get, they also appreciate the build quality, the attention to detail, the design. That plays a big part of it as well. There's a pride of ownership when you purchase a piece of gear at that level. A gear lust, if you will. That's part of it as well. You demand the best, and that's what the Aries gives you on a number of levels. Other advantages of it too are there's included support with the Aries G2.1. I sent off a number of emails to Auralic, and when I was setting it up, I had a number of questions about things, some configuration stuff I was trying to work out. Got a number of emails back very quickly. They were very responsive, very, very helpful. And I was able to get everything up and running, and once I got it set up, I didn't have to touch it ever again. So it's nice to know that you have that sort of support to fall back on if you need it with a product like this. So there's that as well. You also don't need a Rune subscription to use the Aries G2.1. It'll work as endpoint just fine, really, really well. But the Lightning DS software will allow you to use the Aries as your master, digital music unit. So it can control your library completely. So Rune is not necessary. You can also hook up a CD-ROM drive to the Aries, and you have yourself a CD transport built in. And it'll also allow you to rip any of your CDs to FLAC through the Aries without the need of using a separate computer to do that. So there's a number of other advantages you get when you purchase a product of the caliber of the Aries. So in conclusion, the Aries G2.1 is a superb sounding piece of digital gear. If you are looking for the best when it comes to a digital front end and streaming component, it should definitely be on your list of units to check out and explore. It is really quite something. Personally speaking, do I need the Aries G2.1 in my listening life? No, I don't. The Pi and the DAC and Rune work just fine. But do I want an Aries G2.1 in my listening setup? Yes, I do. For me, being the kind of audio nerd that I am, I really appreciate the idea behind the Aries G2.1, the attention to detail, the sort of single-minded focus that someone had to design the thing and just over the top put it together. It's slightly mad, but I dig that kind of stuff. I really dig equipment that's been so singularly focused and just so over the top put together. Yes, it's about the music and about the sound that you hear and stuff, but it's also about the experience and the gear as well. That plays into it as well when you're dealing with equipment at this level. So that pretty much sums up my feelings on the Aries G2.1. So thank you very much for watching the video. Really appreciate it. If you've watched this video on the Secrets YouTube channel, please be sure to hit like and subscribe so you'll be updated on when there's new content that comes on the channel. And thank you very much for watching, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. Take care and all the best to you. Bye.